Welcome back to the realm of history. Today we're going to enter into learning about the Cold War. And one of the things that we're going to start talking about are the world superpowers coming out of World War II, which were really United States and Russia sort of facing off, and the differences between those two countries and what they were trying to accomplish. So we'll take a look at this, understanding that during World War I, the United States and Russia were allies. It all starts at the Yalta Conference, which was put together to develop a post-war plan. It took place in February of 1945, and at this meeting, the British, the American, and Soviet leaders met at the city of Yalta, which is located in southern Russia. Here are the leaders. This is Winston Churchill, right here down at the left side. You've got Franklin Delano Roosevelt seated in the middle. And then you've got Joseph Stalin here at the right. This is a picture, a classic picture of a portion of that meeting. Now, what happened in this meeting is that these three leaders agreed to divide Germany into what they called zones of occupation, and this was meant for when World War II ended. The Soviet leader, this is going to be really important in later parts of this chapter and maybe even in this section, but the Soviet leader Stalin actually agreed to allow free elections to take place in Eastern Europe. Now, he's going to go against that a little bit later on in this chapter. Capital B talks about the creation of the United Nations, which is a step or advancement on the League of Nations. In June 1945, 50 countries came together into this alliance. The United Nations became an international organization of over 50 nations. All of the members were represented in what was called the General Assembly, but then there were 11 that were on the Security Council. There were 5 permanent members that had Security Council veto power, so they had really the upper hand. That's Great Britain, China, France, the United States, and Soviet Union. Now let's take a look at the US and Soviet goals. As we mentioned earlier, that was going to be a really big part of what we're taking a look at here. The United States and Soviets, they obviously had a big split after World War II ended. The United States was actually the richest and most powerful country after World War II. The Soviets were actually recovering from very high war casualties and really the destruction of the vast majority of the western side of their country. Now, there is an important chart. It's on page 966 in the textbook, and it kind of shows what are some of the big differences between the two groups here. You know, one of the things that you can take a look at on this map to the right is that this divider line right here, this black divider line, became known as the Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill would be the person who coined that term, but the influence of the Soviets would be in the red part, and the more tan part would be non-communist countries there. Really, to break this down, the United States wanted to encourage democracy in some of these new countries that were taking place, whereas the Soviet Union wanted communism to spread. And so that's the real big competition and the really big aim that got these two entities into what we now know as the Cold War. Roman numeral 2 will talk about the Iron Curtain, which I showed you on that map here just a second ago. The Soviets moved to build a buffer zone, and what ended up happening here is that the Soviets controlled most of the Eastern European countries after World War II. What happened is Stalin actually installed communist governments in several countries, even though he said that he would allow for free elections. The United States president after Roosevelt was Truman. He urged once again free elections. Stalin had agreed to this before, but now Stalin refuses. He said later in a meeting that that'd be a huge mistake if he allowed free elections because they may become opponents of the Soviet Union. In 1946, Stalin also stated that capitalism and communism, they really cannot coexist. And therefore, we have the Iron Curtain that divided the east and western sides of Europe. Germany was actually physically divided into east and west. The east side, on the Russian side, became communist, whereas the west side was really controlled by the US and Britain. They were democratic. The Iron Curtain, though, as I said earlier, was Winston Churchill's name for the division of Europe into these two distinct parts. And then we get into Roman numeral 3, which talks about how the United States practiced this policy of containment against the Soviets, which was really just the United States' plan to stop the spread of communism. There was also something called the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine, named after President Truman, is where the United States would support countries that rejected communism. Congress actually approved Truman's request for aid to countries like Greece and Turkey, who were fighting for a free democratic society instead of communist plans. We also had something called the Marshall Plan. Much of Western Europe was really in ruins after World War II, and the Marshall Plan was a program from the United States that was meant to assist Western European countries. It was proposed by the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, George Marshall, and Congress actually approved this plan after the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia in 1948. So in essence, it's really just money and funds that the United States gave to Western European powers to rebuild. We also had something called the Berlin Airlift. In 1948, the United States, Britain, and France, they withdrew their forces from West Germany. Their former occupation zones formed one entire country. The Soviets actually were opposed to this and stopped land and water traffic into Western Berlin. West Berlin, which was actually located in the Soviet occupation zone, now faced starvation. The United States and Great Britain both flew in supplies for about 11 months until the Russian blockade and tariff ended. And that really gets us into the Cold War, dividing the world superpowers. And the Cold War can be defined as a struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union using means short of actual war. So it's not actual fighting, and more or less it's the United States sending support to anti-communist countries or sending support to countries that Soviet Union was trying to take over, and vice versa. And sometimes troops would get involved, like in Vietnam or in Korea. The United States did send troops, whereas the Soviet Union didn't. So it continued to be a Cold War just short of actual fighting between the superpowers. And then we have rival alliances being formed, kind of like prior to World War I. In 1949, the United States, Canada, and Western European countries formed what we know of today as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was a defensive military alliance. And then just a bit later in 1955, the Soviets and Eastern European countries signed the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was essentially an alliance of the Soviets and Eastern European nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. In 1961, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall to separate East and West Berlin. One of the big things that was going on during this time was the threat of nuclear war. The Soviet Union actually exploded their first atomic bomb in 1949. The United States and the Soviets were competing to develop a more powerful bomb, which became the hydrogen bomb. And this time period was known as Brinkmanship. Brinkmanship was the willingness to go to the very edge of war, but not totally to war. And what happened is there were increasing tensions, which led to military buildup and an arms race by both the United States and the Soviets. The Cold War actually took place in a competition for space as well. And in 1957, the Soviets made the first move by launching Sputnik, which was the first unmanned satellite. The United States feared that they had fallen behind in science and technology, and they began to revamp the educational system by pushing money into scientific programs. In 1958, the United States launched its own satellite. Then in 1960, the Soviets actually shot down an American spy plane, which was called the U-2, and its pilot, Francis Gary Powers, were captured. Powers served 10 years in a Russian prison and then eventually returned to the United States. These actions did nothing but increase the overall tension between the two countries, of course. So what can you take from all of this? The Cold War, the competition between the United States and Russia. One of the main ideas here is understanding that the differences in opinion based on politics and economics between the United States and Russia coming out of World War II led to great competition between those two world superpowers. And some of that competition basically shaped the landscape of Europe and the surrounding areas that still exist to this day. Hey, if you're finding this information to be helpful, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, like these videos, put some comments in there. If you have any questions for me or comments, I'd love to answer those with you.